Long before steel, before iron, and thousands of years before European ships crossed the Atlantic, people were already mining metal in what is now the United States. Not just finding it, mining it. On the shores of Lake Superior, archaeologists have discovered thousands of ancient mining pits, hammerstones, stone tools, and traces of copper extraction. Some of these workings are thousands of years old. And the strangest part is not that ancient people knew about copper. It is how early they were using it. In parts of Michigan and Wisconsin, indigenous people were extracting naturally occurring copper from the ground thousands of years ago. But who were these miners? How did they discover the deposits? Why did they travel to some of the most difficult places in North America to reach them? And why did later explorers sometimes look at these enormous ancient mining landscapes and assume that some unknown civilization must have built them? The answers are more surprising than the legend, because the evidence points not to a vanished European civilization, but to the ancestors of indigenous peoples who had already been living around the Great Lakes for thousands of years. And yet, many questions remain. To understand the mystery, we have to go back to a time when the landscape itself looked completely different. Thousands of years ago, the Great Lakes region was still recovering from the last ice age. Massive glaciers had moved across North America, carving valleys and reshaping the land. Lake Superior eventually formed within this enormous geological basin. And beneath its shores was something unusual: copper. Not buried deep inside modern industrial mines. In many places, native copper occurred naturally in the rock. Some pieces were exposed at the surface. Others appeared as veins and masses within the bedrock. Geologically, the copper was created more than 1 billion years ago during ancient volcanic activity in the region. Later geological processes concentrated the metal in fractures and cavities within the volcanic rocks. Glaciers then helped expose and transport some of it across the landscape. To a modern observer, this might sound like an obvious opportunity. But imagine seeing a bright piece of metal lying among stones in a wilderness where no metal tools existed. It must have looked extraordinary. And eventually, people began collecting it. At first, they may not have needed to mine anything at all. They could simply pick up pieces of copper that were already exposed. But then something changed. People discovered that the copper was not limited to the surface, continued into the rock. And that created a problem. The metal was valuable, but reaching it required breaking stone. Without steel picks, without explosives, without modern drills, how could anyone remove copper from solid bedrock? The answer was surprisingly simple: stone. Archaeological evidence shows that indigenous miners used rounded stones as hammerstones to strike and break the surrounding rock. Over time, repeated blows created pits and trenches around copper-bearing areas. The process would have been slow, extremely slow. A person would strike the rock again and again and again. Eventually, fragments would break away. The copper could then be removed and worked into useful objects. But who were these people? This is where the story becomes more complicated. For many years, archaeologists used the term Old Copper Culture, or Old Copper Complex, to describe prehistoric societies around the western Great Lakes associated with copper artifacts. These artifacts include spear points, knives, hooks, awls, beads, and other objects. The distribution is enormous. Copper artifacts associated with this tradition have been found across areas of the Great Lakes and beyond, showing that copper was not simply a local curiosity. It moved through ancient networks of exchange. Some finds have been dated to several thousand years ago. The Wisconsin Historical Society notes that research placed the Old Copper Complex broadly between about 3250 and 5900 BC in earlier dating work, while archaeological understanding has continued to develop. But there is an important distinction. Finding a copper artifact thousands of years old does not automatically prove that the person who made it personally mined the copper. Copper could have been traded. It could have been transported over enormous distances. And that is exactly what makes the Great Lakes mystery so fascinating. The people who used the metal were part of a much larger world. Nowhere is this more obvious than Isle Royale. Today, Isle Royale is an isolated island in Lake Superior. It is famous for forests, wolves, moose, and rugged wilderness. But beneath those forests lies another landscape, one created by ancient miners. Archaeologists have identified more than 1,000 prehistoric mining pits on Isle Royale. Some are small. Others form extensive concentrations. The Minong area contains one of the largest and best-preserved indigenous copper mining landscapes known in the region. And there is something almost eerie about walking through these places. The forest has grown back. Moss covers the ground. Trees surround the old workings. But beneath that vegetation are scars left by people who lived thousands of years ago. The pits are physical evidence. Not stories. Not speculation. Not mysterious inscriptions. Actual archaeological features. And scattered around some of them are the tools used to create them. Hammerstones, Simple stones. But they tell an extraordinary story. Someone stood here. Someone picked up that stone. Someone struck the rock. And someone repeated the process enough times to create a mine. But there is another mystery. Why would people travel to Isle Royale at all? The island was isolated by the waters of Lake Superior. Reaching it required crossing open water. The journey could be dangerous. And yet people repeatedly came. Archaeological evidence indicates that indigenous copper mining on Isle Royale lasted for thousands of years. The National Park Service describes copper mining there as spanning more than 4,500 years, with substantial prehistoric activity beginning during the Archaic period. So this was not one expedition. It was not one lost tribe. And it was not a single mysterious civilization that suddenly appeared and disappeared. Instead, copper mining was part of a much longer indigenous history in the Great Lakes. Groups came to the island. They hunted. They fished. They gathered plants. And they mined copper. Then they left. Some returned later. Over generations, the landscape accumulated evidence of their activities. But if they were ordinary indigenous societies, why did 19th century observers sometimes describe the mines as belonging to an unknown ancient people? The answer lies partly in the archaeology of the 19th century. When European-American miners entered the Lake Superior region, they encountered ancient pits and trenches scattered through forests. Some appeared enormous. Others were partially filled with soil. Vegetation had grown over them. The people who created them were long gone. And industrial miners were interested in the same copper. In some places, modern mining followed the traces of older indigenous workings. At the Siskowit mine on Isle Royale, for example, 19th century miners noticed ancient workings but initially misunderstood them, sometimes assuming they represented more recent mining. This helped create an enduring mystery. Who had dug these pits? Some early investigators wondered whether they were evidence of an unknown ancient race. One 19th century observer, Charles Whittlesey, famously wrote about an ancient people who had extracted copper from the veins of Lake Superior. But Whittlesey did not know who those people were. Modern archaeology has changed that picture. The National Park Service explains that the pre-contact artifacts and mining features of the Keweenaw and Isle Royale are indigenous in origin. Their forms, workmanship, and archaeological context correspond to North American indigenous traditions rather than European technology. That is one of the most important points in this entire story. The mystery is not necessarily that an unknown civilization mined America's copper. The mystery is how sophisticated and widespread indigenous copper use was long before Europeans arrived. And there is another question. Did the miners understand the copper deposit in the same way we do? Probably not. There is no evidence that ancient miners had modern geological theories. They did not need them. They learned through observation. A copper vein could be discovered because someone noticed unusual rock. A fragment might be exposed after erosion. A hammerstone could reveal what was beneath the surface. Knowledge could then be passed from one generation to another. Eventually, people knew where copper could be found. That knowledge may have been incredibly valuable. Copper itself was useful, but it also had symbolic and social importance. Historic accounts from the Lake Superior region describe indigenous peoples treating native copper with special significance. A 19th century account recorded that small pieces of copper could be carried as treasured objects and associated with spiritual power. But we have to be careful here. These historical observations were made centuries after the earliest mining. They cannot simply be projected backward to explain exactly what people believed 5,000 or 6,000 years earlier. That is where archaeology ends and interpretation begins. The ancient miners left tools. They left pits. They left copper artifacts. They left traces of trade. But they did not leave us written explanations of why they mined. And that silence creates one of the biggest mysteries. Was copper primarily practical? Was it symbolic? Was it used for status? Was it traded because distant communities valued its unusual appearance? Or was it all of these things at once? The archaeological record suggests a complex answer. Copper objects traveled far beyond the mining districts. Artifacts connected with the old copper complex have been found across broad areas of the Great Lakes and into neighboring regions. That means the story is bigger than Michigan. It is bigger than Isle Royale. It is the story of an ancient network. Imagine a piece of Lake Superior copper leaving the shores of the lake thousands of years ago. It passes from one community to another. Perhaps it becomes a tool. Perhaps an ornament. Perhaps a weapon point. Perhaps a treasured object placed with someone after death. The original miner may never have known where the copper would eventually end up. And yet the metal could travel hundreds of miles. But there is one more misconception worth examining. Some theories claim that the sheer scale of the ancient pits proves that the miners must have been technologically advanced outsiders. The archaeological evidence does not support that conclusion. The mines can be explained through repeated indigenous activity over long periods of time. The National Park Service notes that more than 1,000 pits have been identified on Isle Royale, but also cautions against imagining a single highly organized mining operation. The mining may instead have been integrated into seasonal hunting, fishing, and gathering activities over many generations. In other words, the scale may be misleading. 1,000 pits do not necessarily mean 1,000 miners working at the same time. They may represent thousands of years of human activity, generation after generation, small efforts accumulating into a huge archaeological landscape. And that may actually be more remarkable, because it means these mines were not created by some mysterious supercivilization. They were created by people using simple tools, local knowledge, persistence, and time. But the story still contains unanswered questions. We do not know exactly who the first miners were by name. We cannot identify a single old copper people as though they were one uniform civilization. Archaeologists recognize cultural traditions and changing populations across the region. The societies involved evolved over thousands of years. Different groups occupied different areas. They traded, they moved, they interacted, and their identities cannot always be reconstructed from a copper tool alone. We also do not know exactly when the very first person discovered the copper deposits. The earliest evidence for human presence around the Lake Superior Basin reaches far back into the early Holocene, but evidence directly connecting the earliest inhabitants to copper mining is much less certain. The National Park Service notes that early populations were present in the region thousands of years ago, while their specific interest in copper during the earliest periods remains unproven. That distinction matters. It separates archaeology from legend. We can say that indigenous peoples mined copper thousands of years ago. We can say that ancient mining landscapes survive in Michigan and Isle Royale. We can say that copper artifacts traveled widely. But we cannot honestly claim that we know the name of the first person who struck the first copper vein. That person is lost to time. Perhaps it happened by accident. Perhaps someone saw a strange metallic fragment in the ground. Perhaps a stone struck the rock and revealed something unexpected. And perhaps that moment began a tradition that lasted for thousands of years. Today, places like the Minong Copper Mining District preserve part of that story. In 2021, the Minong Copper Mining District on Isle Royale was designated a National Historic Landmark. The site contains both indigenous mining remains and later industrial mining history, allowing archaeologists to see two very different eras of copper extraction in the same landscape. The contrast is striking. Modern miners arrived with industrial equipment. Ancient miners arrived with stone. Modern mining transformed entire hillsides. Ancient miners created pits with repeated blows of hammerstones. And yet both were pursuing the same metal, copper, a metal formed by geological forces more than 1 billion years ago. A metal exposed and reshaped by glaciers. A metal discovered by people living in North America thousands of years before European contact. And a metal that helped connect communities across an enormous continent. So who mined America's ancient copper mines? The evidence points to indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region. Not a lost European expedition. Not a vanished Old World empire. And not a civilization for which archaeology has found no evidence. But that answer does not make the story less mysterious. It makes it more human, because somewhere thousands of years ago, an unknown person stood beside a vein of native copper. They had no steel tools, no explosives, no written instructions, only stone, experience, and time. They struck the rock, and something bright emerged. We will probably never know what that person thought in that exact moment. We do not know their name. We do not know the words they spoke. We do not know whether they understood that the strange metal beneath their feet would eventually travel across an entire region. But we know one thing. They found it. They learned how to remove it. And their descendants continued the work for generations. The forests have grown over the pits. The people who made them are long gone. But the scars remain. And perhaps that is the real mystery of America's ancient copper mines. Not who built some lost civilization, but how much we still do not know about the indigenous civilizations that were already here. Thousands of years before modern America existed, people were exploring these forests, crossing these waters, trading across vast distances, and transforming one of the world's great natural copper deposits with nothing more than stone tools. So the next time you look at the forests around Lake Superior, remember this. Beneath the trees may be a landscape created by people who lived thousands of years ago. And somewhere beneath the soil, there may still be another ancient pit waiting to be found. The question is, how many stories are still buried there?